Okay, so this project's going to be forging a cold chisel. Now, cold chisel is used for like chipping off slag around a weld, cutting off rusty bolts, removing splatter when you're welding. So we're going to start out with a piece of hexagon tool steel. Now, it's pretty smooth to start with. It already has 6 sides, so we're going to cut a piece off on the bandsaw about 7 inches long. Now we want to make sure the bandsaw is feeding nice and slow. Put a little bit of cutting oil on the metal, and then about every 10 to 15 seconds add a little bit of more cutting oil, and what that oil is going to do is help the blade slide across the metal easier, reduce friction, and it's also going to help pull the heat out of the metal and out of the blade to keep the blade from overheating. Now, once the saw gets all the way down through the cut, it'll automatically shut itself off. Make sure when you grab the metal in the vise that you're grabbing on a flat spot. Okay, to start the furnace, we want to start out by hitting the start button. When we push the little black button, the igniter will ignite the gas. You want to hold the gas lever at about the 1 o'clock area and hold that black button in until the red light goes out. Once the red light goes out, you want to adjust it so it's as loud as possible, and then close the lid. Now when you're lighting it, make sure that lid's open, because those gases, when they ignite, are going to expand, and if that lid's open, this gas will go straight up in the air. If not, they're going to come out right towards your face. So what we want to do is heat the end of the metal up about the last 2 inches up until it's red hot. Now once it's red hot, it's going to be really easy to manipulate the molecules and change the shape of the metal. Now the metal is going to have about a 2-inch taper on it down to not quite a point. We're going to leave about a 1/4 inch flat spot on the end. So since the metal is going to be tapered, we want to hold the metal at an angle, a slight angle up off the anvil whenever we start pounding. And don't hold your hammer square to the anvil. Hold it at the same angle that you want the top of the chisel to be shaped to. Now start working on the end, and as you pound on it, it's going to be pounding one side down, and the other side will get flattened up against the top of the anvil. So you'll notice as you're pounding, one side's going to have hammer marks, the other side will be nice and smooth because of the smooth top surface of the anvil. Now, you don't want to get any big divots in the metal when you're pounding on it, because you're going to have to make that surface nice and smooth. If you have a big dent, it's going to be hard to get that out. Now we want the width of the chisel tip to be about the same as the width of the metal we start with. So as you're pounding on the end of the metal is getting wider and wider as it's getting thinner and thinner. So you have to kind of flip it over on the side and pound it down to keep the size from getting too wide. Okay, so this is where the craftsmanship comes in. You're going to have to know how hard to hit it, which way to hit it, keep manipulating the sides so it doesn't get too wide. Once you get the tip down close to where you want it, now start working on your length. You want to taper that back about 2 inches, so it has a 2-inch long taper down to about a 1/8 inch flat spot on the end. Now what's happening here is, what you're doing is you're realigning the molecules and compressing the molecules of the metal. And when you're doing that, you're making the metal harder out there on the tip. So that's why we want to really compress that tip down. So, and when you first start your pounding, you want to do all your pounding on one of the flat spots. So if you follow one of those flat spots, it leads right down to the blade, the width of the blade. So they're like formed on the same plane. So once you get the end down to about 1/8 of an inch, the last hammer you want to use is going to be like for a nice smooth hammer to give you a nice smooth finish, because like I said, you don't want to have any dents or divots in the metal. You want it to be nice and smooth, so select a finishing hammer, a machinist hammer that has a nice smooth face on it, so you're going to leave a nice smooth surface. Okay, so this is shaping the metal on the anvil in the forge. The belt sander is used for just smoothing off the metal. It's not made for removing metal, but more or less smoothing out what's there. So all of your shaping needs to be on the anvil with the sledgehammer working to forge. The belt sander is just for smoothing things off. So you want to smooth those faces of the blade off so that there's no black spots. Any place where you have a black spot, that's a spot where there's a dent that you hit too hard with a hammer, and you're going to have to sand until that black spot's gone. So make sure when you're done with the anvil, the metal's nice and smooth, because when you go to do your sanding, it's going to take you a long time. If you have too big of dents, you're going to have to go to like a grinder, a belt, or a disc sander or disc grinder to grind out the metal down to get it smooth enough to start sanding. Now, as you're doing the faces, you can go ahead and do the long flat side that lines up with the face, and you can go ahead and sand the sides down to make sure your width is the same all the way down the length of the chisel. Now you're only going to be able to do this, the two sides that line up with your blade, the face of your blade. You're not going to be able to do the other four sides. We'll have to do that by hand sanding it. So carbon, as the metal gets real hot, rises to the surface of the metal, and when it cools off, it creates like a crust. So we want to make sure all that crust is sanded off. Now, whenever we were done with our forging, notice that we didn't cool the metal off in water. We just let it cool off naturally. And once it was cool to temperature, you can touch it, then we started working on it. You don't want to put it in water and cool it off real fast, because that makes the metal really hard. So at this point, we're just working on the metal when it's kind of soft. The next step will be to actually harden it. So we want to do all our shaping and sanding and finishing while the metal's still soft. So the end of the blade, the end of the metal, the 1/8 inch wide part that we left, isn't going to be real straight. So we're going to want to take it to a grinder and remove metal from the end until it's nice and straight. So keep working the metal back and forth lightly up against the grinding wheel. When you're using the grinding wheel, you don't want to push in on the metal. You just want to let the metal touch the grinding wheel. And those little sparks you see coming off there are red hot glowing pieces of molten metal. You don't want to get those in your eyes. So make sure you have safety glasses on. Make sure you're doing your sanding just right on or above the table. You want the sparks to be going down whenever you're sanding or grinding. So keep working it side to side. What you got to do is kind of look for the high spot on the stone and do all your sanding on the high spot. Then you can adjust the table to be at a slight angle, to hold the metal at a slight angle to put the blade on the chisel. Now, we could use the sander, but like I said, the sander is just for smoothing off the metal. It's not made for removing metal. The grinder's made for removing metal. So depending on what angle you want the blade of the chisel to be, depends on how you're going to be holding it. So you want to make sure the width of the blade is the same on both sides, and you keep working it down until it's a nice sharp point. If you can look at the end of the blade and still see a flat spot, you haven't sharpened it quite enough yet. Okay, now once we get over to the done with the grinder, you can take it back over the belt sander and just smooth out that tip. We're not grinding a tip on it, we're just smoothing out the tip that you put on there. Now, as you're doing this grinding, sanding, the metal is going to get hot. It's okay to take it over and cool it off every once in a while so it's cool enough that you can handle it with your hands. Now this is a good time to mention when you're using a belt sander, you don't want to let your fingers touch the sandpaper or it'll sand your fingernails down real fast. And it also is good for removing fingerprints. Okay, keep those safety glasses on when you're using the belt sander also. And you're going to put a nice consistent tip on there that's even on both sides and is the same width the whole way across until it comes to a point. Okay, now it's sharp, it comes to a point, but that tip is not really hard yet. So the next thing we want to do is harden that tip so it's going to hold that blade or that edge. Because remember, we're going to be pounding this, up against steel, cutting bolts with it. It's got to be really hard. Okay, so to harden it, we got to get that metal red hot again on the tip. So we're going to have to take it back to the furnace, heat it back up, and get it red hot again. Now, whenever you cool a blade off or a piece of metal off, steel, real fast, it's going to make the metal really hard. Okay? If you let it cool down slowly over a long period of time, it's called annealing, and it's going to allow that to stay softer. Okay, it's not going to make it real soft. It's going to allow it to be, not as hard as when it's tempered. So when you heat this up and temper it, we want to quench it in water. So it's real critical about when you put it in water. If you put it in when it's red hot, the metal will be so hard that when you go to use it, it could break the tip off. So you want to wait until there's no red coloring left in the metal from being heated. When all the red's gone and it's cooled off to a point where there's no more red hot, nothing red whatsoever you can see, drop it in water all at once to get it to cool off real fast. Once that's done, we're ready to put some type of finish on it. Now we'll do the finishing later on, but this is just, the forging part.